Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Provincial HSJCC webinar. My name is Trevor Timchak. I'm a person with lived experience and a consultant with the HSJCC, and I will be your host today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will conclude at 1 p.m. The link to the recording, slides, and resources will be emailed to you following the webinar. It will also be posted on the HSJCC's YouTube site and website. We will be enabling the chat box shortly. You can leave comments in there. However, to make it easier to sift through questions, we ask that you use the Q&A box. There will be a dedicated Q&A period at the end of our webinar. We will hold a few minutes at the end of the webinar for a short survey to hear your feedback from today's session. This survey will also be emailed to you following the webinar. The Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committee Network is comprised of 38 local committees, 14 regional committees, and 1 provincial HSJCC. Each HSJCC is a voluntary collaboration between health and social service organizations, community mental health and addictions organizations, and partners from the justice sector, including Crown attorneys, judges, police services, and correctional service providers. Please visit our website for more information. To learn more about the HSJCC and access previous webinar recordings and resources, you can visit our website at hsjcc.on.ca. Before I hand it over to our presenters, Ali Stevenson from the HSJCC Secretariat will be providing a land acknowledgement and reflection.
Thank you, Trevor, and welcome everybody. It's so great to see 179 and 180 and counting joining us today. So just before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment and thank the OFIFC for being here today and just for the consistent care and commitment that you bring to this work and the communities that you serve. While we're gathering virtually, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. This land is covered by Treaty 13 and remains home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. I just want to share my gratitude also to the OFIFC for recently welcoming me to their Justice Gathering, which is a 2-day in-person gathering. And it was really a meaningful opportunity to be in community and just connect with people from across the province. And I would say what stayed with me most was not only the passion in the room over those 2 days, but also the honesty and vulnerability and lived experiences that were shared. As a settler, I recognize that I will never fully understand the depth of harm and ongoing impacts experienced by Indigenous peoples. With that comes a responsibility to continue learning from Indigenous histories and culture and to build respectful, meaningful relationships that are grounded in humility and accountability as we work to advance reconciliation. One additional reflection that I carried forward from the day and just in my work with the OFIFC is the importance and value of reciprocity, really grounding our work in relationality through listening, engaging with different worldviews, and being open to different ways of knowing beyond our own is truly essential in advancing the work of reconciliation and creating meaningful and lasting change. I invite those of us here today and joining us today to reflect on what reciprocity looks like in your own work, whether that be with clients, with colleagues, or communities that you work with. How can we ensure that our approaches are not only informed by Indigenous histories and cultures, but are also reciprocal and rooted in mutual respect and benefit? So again, just wanted to thank the OFIFC, Chelsea, Hayden, and Nick for being here today. I'm very grateful for the ongoing relationship that we have between the Provincial HSJCC and the OFIFC to bring webinars like this to you and continue our provincial work together. So I look forward to continuing to strengthen our connection and ultimately support a more coordinated, responsive, and community-led approach to supporting individuals most vulnerable in our community. So thank you so much and really looking forward to this today.
Thank you, Ali. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today. Chelsea Sidlowski, Anti-Human Trafficking Project Manager, Hayden Moore, Senior Policy Advisor Justice, and Nick Hazel, Senior Program Advisor Justice from the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres. And to learn more about the work of the OFIFC and find a friendship centre near you, visit their website at ofifc.org.
Okay, sorry. Just took me about 100 hours to unmute myself. Okay, I'll just share my screen 1 second here. Hey, can everyone see my screen okay? Yeah, okay, perfect. Well, first off, I'll just start by thanking you so much for the introduction, and also thank you to the HSJCC for having us here today. As mentioned, I'm Chelsea, so I'm the Anti-Human Trafficking Project Manager at the OFIFC, and I'm joined here today by my really amazing colleagues who are also supporting a lot of the great work that we're doing to support the Friendship Centers. So throughout my role, I'm leading the development of a Friendship Center-led anti-human trafficking strategy, program model, and toolkit that's really grounded in engagements that we've been having with Friendship Centers across Ontario. And so today we'll basically just be walking you through how human trafficking is showing up in urban Indigenous communities based on what we've heard in our engagements with Friendship Centers, how it develops over time, and also what this means across the systems that you all work in. Okay, so with that, I'll pass it to Hayden to speak a little bit on the history of the movement.
Okay, thanks, Chelsea, and good afternoon, everyone. Just to start off a bit about the Friendship Center movement and its history of supporting community members. The Friendship Center movement began in the 1950s and 60s. It was a grassroots community movement driven in part by amendments to the Indian Act at the time, which meant it was no longer illegal for First Nations people to engage in a number of activities, for example, to gather in groups of more than three, to leave the reserve without a pass, and to practice their culture. One result of these changes was that more people were moving from reserves to urban centers. As I'm sure you can imagine, the transition from the reserve to an urban center was a difficult one. Indigenous people were often met with racism and discrimination, and the Friendship Center movement grew out of that environment. They were places where people could learn how to navigate the urban environment, and friendship centers became invaluable. They were critical for the growth of urban Indigenous communities, shaping their culture and their identity. Today, 88% of Indigenous people in Ontario live in urban settings, and that number is only growing. Urban Indigenous communities are diverse, and they can include First Nations, Métis, Inuit, registered, non-registered, and self-identifying individuals. They include people who are far away from their home reserve or territory, people that were born within an urban center, and people that have just moved there. Some people have deep community connections, and others do not. However, Friendship Centers support them all. And today, the Friendship Center movement is the largest urban Indigenous service delivery network, providing critical Indigenous-led, community-based supports to urban Indigenous communities. And very briefly, as for Chelsea, Nick, and myself, we work for the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres, or the OFIFC. The OFIFC was founded in 1971. and it's a provincial organization that represents our 21 member friendship centers located across the province. And our work is directed by the friendship centers and their priorities, and we aim to support them with funding, training, policy work, advocacy, and program support. And that.
Thanks, Hayden. Okay, so we thought we'd just provide a bit of background on the Anti-Human Trafficking Project before we get into the depths of the conversation. So going back to 2023, the OFIFC conducted very thorough engagements to support the Indigenous Justice Strategy, or the IJS. And so for some of you that don't know about this strategy, this is really meant for the government to look at how to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous people that we're seeing in the justice system. And so part of the OFIFC going out to do these engagements was not only to support that strategy, but to really identify what are the Friendship Center priorities in addressing this strategy and moving forward. And so within those engagements, something that was made very clear was that human trafficking is a crisis. It has been for decades, but it's only been getting worse. And so this was identified across all of the Friendship Centers. And so this made it really clear to the justice team that we need to do something more about this. And so we were actually successful in applying for funding, which we received from the Department of Justice through the Victims Fund. So we ended up receiving 5 years of project funding. I hate to say that term, project funding, 'cause it's not a project, but we got the money, and so that part of that was hiring me to support in leading this project. And so there's been 3 overall goals that we've really been working towards. And so one is developing a Friendship Center informed anti-human trafficking toolkit, an anti-human trafficking program model, and then also a strategy to support Friendship Centers in addressing human trafficking, but to also provide them with tools that they can use on a daily basis to support survivors of human trafficking, individuals that might be at risk that are not necessarily in the process, but also to look at the demand side and focus on perhaps what are the conditions that are leading individuals to fall into actually becoming traffickers. And so we just wanted to provide a little bit of background on this, just to show that a lot of the information we're providing today has actually been informed by the engagements that have been undertaken through this project. So we also wanted to provide just some terminology. I'm sure a lot of people on the call are most likely aware of human trafficking, but always just like to include this in case there's some folks that are not. So human trafficking is the recruitment, the transport, transfer, harboring, or receipt of a person by such means as threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, or deception for the purpose of exploitation. And under human trafficking are subforms. So these are just 2 forms. However, you may have heard of many other forms, but typically the 2 main forms that we see are labor trafficking. So this is a form of human trafficking that involves recruiting, moving, or holding victims to coerce them into doing anything to do with work. And so oftentimes you'll see this a lot with like migrants or newcomers that come to the country. They're promised that, they'll get to work in a specific role and, end up, they come to the country, maybe they end up on a farm and realize that whatever was presented to them looks nothing like that. And so they end up finding them in a process of trafficking. Oftentimes, citizenship and those type of things are kind of held over their head to keep them in that process. And then there's sex trafficking. So this is a form of human trafficking that involves recruiting, moving, or holding victims for sexual exploitation purposes. Sex traffickers can coerce victims into providing sexual services by force or through threats. So that can include mental and emotional abuse, and also manipulation. And then you'll notice on the other side, I've also included the definition of sex work. And the reason I've done this is because oftentimes we're seeing that sex trafficking and sex work are conflated, whether that be in the law enforcement, in the justice system, or just the general public. And so I think it's always really important to provide the differences, the definitions, but also for us as people working in social service spaces or the justice space to think about, when you are supporting a survivor or victim, just to think about what process are they in, and that will also equip you in better supporting folks. So, sex work is a consensual exchange of sexual services between adults for money or goods, while selling one's own sexual services is legal. The surrounding activities, such as buying, advertising, and third-party involvement, are illegal. So, we wanted to share what we've been hearing about how trafficking is actually appearing on the ground in urban Indigenous communities. One thing that's been made very clear is that sex trafficking is the predominant form that we're seeing. However, we are hearing of increasing rates of labor trafficking, specifically when individuals are leaving like correctional institutions and don't have that aftercare support. They end up falling through the cracks, whether it be that they're vulnerable to human trafficking or maybe because they don't have enough money or they don't have housing, they're actually vulnerable into falling into gang movement. And so they may actually end up becoming a trafficker to, pay for their bills. We know that human trafficking is a very high profit, low risk activity. So it can make a lot of money, unfortunately, but it's also low risk. So we know that the general public still doesn't have a really good understanding of what human trafficking looks like. But also with law enforcement, it's really hard to get on top of this just because of the nature of how human trafficking takes place. And we've also heard a lot about the intersections. And so Friendship Center staff have emphasized that trafficking can oftentimes intersect with issues like intimate partner violence. So, for example, we do know that oftentimes, if it's not specifically gang related, that human trafficking actually starts with intimate partner violence, or where somebody believes that they're in a healthy relationship and then quickly comes to find that they're not. And then that grooming stage is actually taking place in the intimate partner violence stage before it turns into fully blown trafficking. We also see that a lot of times it's gang initiated. And so that's been a big thing that we've been hearing. But also for individuals that are being initiated into gangs, this might be something that they're asked to do. And we're oftentimes also seeing where an individual may be being trafficked themselves and at the same time are being asked to lure others. So we're seeing almost this process of forced criminalization take place against survivors and victims. Housing instability is really big, and I'm sure people on the call know this. I think without housing stability, it's going to be really hard to see human trafficking rates decrease. Poverty and economic vulnerability, like I said, we know there's a lot of money in trafficking. Mental health and addictions. We've heard oftentimes that, well, traffickers will provide free substances. So that's a way of keeping survivors in that cycle, especially because they know that they'll always have access. Online and social media exploitation is really big as well. We're seeing this with youth, especially with apps like Snapchat, Instagram, even Facebook, where that's a lot of times that's where a lot of the luring is taking place. So that's something that friendship centers have been thinking about, and even with our own programming, thinking about how can we support youth and parents more so in the prevention stage before it gets to the crisis. Also, we've heard that there's been a lot of challenges for survivors when trying to navigate systems that oftentimes criminalize them. So we know that this happens a lot of times in the justice system, but it can also happen in social service spaces. And sometimes it happens without individuals knowing. And an example of this is going back to understanding the difference between like a sex worker and somebody being sex trafficked. We have heard from survivors that oftentimes they are dislabeled as a sex worker. And so that actually takes their autonomy away, and often just very disrespectful. So I think that's something that we definitely encourage providers across the table to think about. Child welfare. So especially when we see youth transitioning out of care as well, they're very vulnerable to that. They may be vulnerable to being trafficked, but also we know that a lot of individuals that are unfortunately doing the trafficking were victims at one point, especially in the child welfare experience. So that's something to think about where, a child is victimized most of their life. And that's almost like all they've been introduced to. So now they've fallen into some of this gang violence that we're seeing. And then special economic zones. So, recently, like with the Ring of Fire, the increase of resource extraction sites, mines, we're definitely seeing an increase in sex trafficking.
Okay, so hi everyone. This map comes from the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, and it really sort of highlights that sex trafficking is happening right here in Ontario, in urban, in rural, and also in friendship center communities. So as Chelsea has been speaking about, people across the Friendship Center movement are seeing these impacts directly, right? So they're seeing them in justice work, housing instability, supports that are required for youth, family violence, or other sort of crisis response work. And when we speak about sex trafficking specifically, the Highway 401 corridor, which is sort of shown here, is widely recognized as one of the key routes that traffickers use to move people between these cities for the purpose of exploitation. And Public Safety Canada and other government and community organizations have explicitly noted that trafficking is connected to movement along these major 400 highways. So obviously, it follows that the largest sex markets tend to be these urban areas, which are highlighted here. And Statistics Canada also reported that over the last 10 years, something like 85% of incidents that were reported were in these census metropolitan areas. So, it goes to figure that sex trafficking is an urban Indigenous reality, right? So friendship centers are in these urban spaces, as Hayden had spoken about. They're places where Indigenous people come for safety, for services, connection, community, culture. And, so friendship center movement is not separate from the issue, right? So it needs to be also central to the response. As I mentioned, the majority of these sites that are listed on this map have friendship centers in them. And because if sex trafficking is moving through Ontario's urban corridors, like it's shown here, then it goes to figure that urban Indigenous organizations, such as friendship centers, that are rooted in community and also in culture, are among the strongest places to interrupt that harm and sort of support healing for people.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So what I want to show here is that human trafficking is not a single event. It's really a process. We don't go too much into depth because I'm sure there's some, basic knowledge on the process of human trafficking. So like I said, it's really a process, and this is something that we've heard time and time again consistently through our engagements with friendship centers across the province. We're seeing that it often does begin with structural vulnerability, so things like housing, instability, poverty, experiences of violence, or like I said, youth transitioning out of care. And these are not individual failures necessarily. They're much broader system coordinations, broader system conditions that create this risk that we're seeing. Oftentimes, I say that human trafficking it's not really a justice issue. It turns into a justice issue, but it begins with a systems issue. So that's something that we need to think about. And so from that structural vulnerability that we see, from there, individuals may start to be targeted and groomed, and often through relationships. And so, as we discussed, this can look like a romantic partner, someone that's offering support initially, or someone that's building trust over time. And at this stage, it doesn't necessarily always look harmful. Actually, most of the times it looks like care, might look like love, attention, or stability. Um, and over time, that relationships begin to shift and create dependency, whether that be emotionally, financially, or physical. Like I said, or sometimes free substances are also being provided. And so this is where it becomes much more difficult for someone to leave. And from there, exploitation may begin, whether that be sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And so this usually happens very gradually, and sometimes framed as helping financially or contributing in some way, and it can escalate over time. And eventually, this will lead to control through manipulation, through threats, isolation, or violence. And so, what's really important about this is that there's multiple points, if you think about it, where intervention is possible, and not just at the point of exploitation. And so, I think that's something as service providers, whether you're in government or grassroots or general civil society, it's something that we should think about. And what we've heard across friendship centers is that many individuals are already interacting with systems during these earlier stages, but trafficking is not necessarily always being recognized at that point. So understanding trafficking as a process really helps us to start thinking about where earlier intervention and prevention can happen. So I'll pass it to Hayden.
Okay, thanks, Chelsea. So building on what we just discussed about trafficking being a process, one of the earliest stages we heard about throughout the engagements is targeting and grooming. What's important to understand is that traffickers are not selecting people at random. They often identify individuals who are already experiencing some form of vulnerability. And from what we heard from the friendship centers, this often includes youth leaving care, individuals experiencing housing instability, those facing violence or isolation, and individuals experiencing poverty. These are situations where someone may be looking for support, stability, or connection, and that is where the exploitation can begin. Recruitment often happens through relationships. This can look like a romantic partner, someone within a peer network, or someone connecting through social media. Sorry. In some cases, we also heard about connections through gang recruitment. And what is important, as Chelsea already alluded to, is that this does not always look harmful at the beginning. From the outside and even to the person experiencing it, it can actually look like care, attention, or support. For example, a young person who has recently left care may meet someone who offers them a place to stay, buys them food, and provides emotional support. Over time, that relationship builds trust, and the young person may begin to rely on that person for stability. At first, nothing about the situation appears exploitive, but over time, that dynamic can shift. What we heard is that exploitation often begins with someone meeting a need and then using that need to create control. And that is where we will start to see the transition from targeting and grooming, move into dependency. Thank you. So building on the targeting and grooming, as I mentioned, it develops into a dependency, and over time, the relationship shifts from something that felt supportive to something that creates a reliance. And that reliance can be emotional, financial, or physical. From what we heard, this often includes reliance on someone for housing, income, transportation, or even, a sense of more general safety or belonging. And at the same time, individuals may become increasingly isolated from their existing support. That can include isolation from family, friends, or other community connections. We also heard about movement between cities, which can further isolate individuals and make it more difficult to maintain a consistent support system. Another key dynamic is trauma bonding, and that's where cycles of care and harm create a strong emotional attachment, even in situations that are harmful. From the outside, it can be really difficult to understand, and survivors may appear resistant to help or protective of the person that's causing harm. But again, what we heard from the friendship centers is that the responses are not irrational. They are part of how people navigate complex and unsafe situations. And what we're seeing at this stage in the process is not simply exploitation, but it's a combination of dependency, isolation, and control that makes leaving extremely difficult. And it's here that we begin to understand why intervention is not always straightforward. Why it's not straightforward and may lead to questions of why survivors may not leave. And what the Friendship Centers told us is that many survivors at this stage simply do not have access to support that they need to leave safely. And that includes, as has been alluded to, safe and stable housing, consistent and trusted support, access to flexible, affordable, and culturally relevant legal support that can help them navigate systems without being further harmed or further criminalized. And so what we are seeing at this stage is not just exploitation, but a combination of dependency, isolation, and gaps in support that make leaving extremely difficult for folks.
Okay, thanks, Hayden. So why are we not seeing survivors not necessarily leave? I know in friendships, when we went into do our engagements with friendship centers, we heard some professional examples, but also some personal examples where there was frustration, where they, may have known of a family member or a friend, where they're just so frustrated because they felt like they've provided so many tools and resources, and they still kind of end up staying in that cycle. And so Hayden has covered, I think, most of these. So oftentimes we see this lack of culturally safe services. And friendship centers are really good at understanding that culture is really a protective factor. And so even though right now we're building out an anti-human trafficking program, they have actually been doing anti-human trafficking work for decades. It just hasn't necessarily been termed in that way. And so oftentimes you see that need for culture and healing really needs to be at the center, but also flexibility. And so that's something that not only the justice system can focus on in friendship centers, but also across the system. We know what we've heard is that, and this is, I think, based on statistics, it takes around 7 times for a survivor to successfully exit the process. And that can be, going to social service supports, through the justice system, that maybe it's through a friend or, family support, trying to support them to leave. And so when you think about that, and you also think about, for example, the traumatic brain injuries that might be taking place as well, it's a really complex situation, especially if the individual is addicted to substances, which oftentimes is the case. So, for example, expecting somebody to completely get off substances, we know is not, that's not really realistic. And oftentimes, in a lot of supports, whether that may be, non-substance based, what do you call it? Like therapeutic type rehab, sometimes that is necessary. And so more and more we're seeing an increase in a better understanding of knowing that you can't just expect, someone to just jump off the substances just like that. But also fear of violence. So this is a really big thing, especially if it's a gang initiated. Oftentimes during that kind of that grooming and luring stage, there's a lot of studying that takes place where traffickers are studying the individual's family, their community, maybe their school and their workplace. And so there's a lot of threats that are on the line. And so that fear of violence is very real, not just to that individual, but also the people around them. So threats to family, financial dependence, we've talked about this, housing instability, mistrust of systems. We're also hearing more and more that survivors are being denied access into shelters because, sometimes you can't blame them because there is that feeling of, increased insecurity, especially if there is traffickers that are monitoring the space. So that once again is now just creating an even larger gap of our systems being able to successfully support survivors. So what we often see in practice is that systems are engaging after harm is caused, after harm has happened, and once it's occurred already, and most responses happen once exploitation or crisis has already taken place, whether that's through the justice system, emergency services, or other crisis-based supports. And this aligns with what we've heard, through our engagements. Many individuals are already interacting with systems, as we talked about, but it's just that trafficking is not properly being recognized until much later in the process. But prevention doesn't necessarily need to start at exploitation. It can start much earlier. So it can begin at the points where we actually know that vulnerability can take place. So that includes looking at housing instability, youth leaving care, even like focusing on elementary schools and education for young children. Because the reality is that it is actually, especially in urban Indigenous communities, it's young children that are being preyed on. It's also understanding experiences of violence and also economic insecurity. And I think from there, prevention, like I said, can also include early education, awareness, but also culturally grounded supports. And so, as service providers that may not be Indigenous specific, that's where other Indigenous organizations can come in. And there's a lot of really great Indigenous organizations, in addition to the friendship centers, that we really encourage folks to reach out to for that culture specific programming and also learning as well. Another thing is stability and connection, which are critical. And so, whether that be a culturally identity safe space or program, thinking about also relationships and community, oftentimes because of the nature of human trafficking, where we're seeing individuals being moved, they are very isolated. So relationships don't always need to be a family member. Maybe that's a relationship that's created through a social service space, in a safe way. But having access to stability and relationships and trust is really important for survivors. And so, just to add, as a system, we need to be thinking about the long-term pathways. So, in addition to education, employment, and community connection, and all of those things we talked about, we also need to think about what does success look like for Indigenous people, Indigenous youth, Indigenous elders. Oftentimes, we see a large focus with marginalized communities where it stops at justice, where it stops at the problem, instead of us trying to envision like what does success and sustained success actually look like for Indigenous youth and their communities. And we know it's not enough to stop that support, um, you know, just at, in one area. We really need to focus on building full, more meaningful life pathways, just like how any other youth have access to. So it's really about shifting from a reactive approach to one that's more proactive, coordinated, and grounded in long-term success. And I think friendship centers are doing a really great job of this. And I know it's not very easy, to be able to identify human trafficking, but I think, for example, this conversation today is a really good starting point. I can give a quick example that we heard actually at one of our friendship centers, and it was a food support worker that runs a food bank and provides food for individuals. And this is somebody that's not, their focus is not in working in anti-human trafficking. But she had an individual come in and notice that she came in on specific days at the same time every week. And she always just seemed really uncomfortable. She didn't make a lot of eye contact. And within the conversation that she was having with this individual, she heard her say, "Oh, the girls would love this." And then the next week, she heard her say that again. "Oh, the girls would love these sanitary pads. The girls would love this food." And that actually clicked. And I think also the staff, explained that her gut feeling was kind of off. And so she decided to further that conversation and actually came to find that this individual was being coerced into staying and living in a trap house and was being trafficked. And so obviously not everyone can be able to identify these things, but I think with more education, we can start, thinking about what are maybe some of the terms that we should talk about with our staff or our teams, or what are some of the practices we've heard that are actually happening on the ground or within gang violence. So I'll pass it back to Hayden.
Hey, thanks. And so this slide, we just wanted to highlight again, and I think Chelsea's already kind of alluded to it, but that the trafficking does not sit within one system. It really requires coordination across systems. And so we just wanted to highlight, for example, that we've heard from the Friendship Center engagements that trafficking intersects with child welfare, housing, justice, mental health, substance use, gender-based violence, private corporations, and local businesses. So again, just highlighting that what is required really is a coordinated response. And then quickly getting into demand drivers. So far, we've been talking about vulnerability and how trafficking develops, but it's also important to recognize that trafficking does not happen without demand. From our engagement work, what we heard is that trafficking is not only driven by vulnerability, but also by systems and conditions that create and sustain demand. One of the most significant drivers is the demand for commercial sex, which creates ongoing opportunities for exploitation. We also heard about the role of gang economies, where trafficking can be part of a broader system of control and income generation. For example, statistics, show that in a bad year, a trafficker can make $200,000 on one individual's body. Housing instability is another key factor. When individuals do not have access to safe and stable housing, they may rely on others for survival, and which can turn exploitative. There are also increasing concerns around online exploitation, particularly through social media and digital platforms, where recruitment and control can happen more easily and really without visibility. And finally, economic vulnerability plays a huge role. When individuals are navigating poverty or lack of financial stability, it can increase their risk of exploitation. So that's just to show that, or it showed us that trafficking is not just about individual systems. It is sustained through broader social, economic, and and structural conditions. Oh, sorry. Me again. Yeah, so this is just these trafficking patterns. These are things that we see in Ontario. So as we've mentioned, movement between cities, also the use of hotels and short-term rentals, links to gangs and drug trafficking, the use of online recruitment, and the targeting of youth and young persons.
Okay, thanks. So sort of turning towards wrapping things up, we wanted to turn our attention back to the reality of, of day-to-day work in community, right? So many of these situations may already be showing up in your workplaces, in your programs, and also just in community more generally. And we've also heard through Friendship Center engagements, and Chelsea's given an example of that, is that these indicators are often there, but they're not always recognized for what they are, right? So, I'm not going to read through this list, but a controlling partner that may always be present, answers questions for somebody or doesn't want them to speak alone, or, patterns of movement. Obviously on their own, these signs can be explained away, right? Or they could be sort of up to other factors, right? But when several of them really start to show up together, or when these same concerns keep coming up over time, it can, usually point to something more serious, right? So really what we're talking about is becoming cognizant and just learning to recognize patterns, contexts, and change that we may be seeing over time, right? And for those who are working in community like yourselves and like people that work in the friendship centers, you're often for the best position to see these things before the exploitation is possibly even formally identified. So I think as it's been alluded to several times, this early recognition can create those opportunities for support, for safety, and before harm really deepens. So more specifically in terms of Indigenous people, and if you can go to the next slide, in terms of Indigenous people, friendship centers really can facilitate that safety, support, and then intervention in a culturally mindful way that is really most meaningful and impactful to those Indigenous people, right? So it's important to keep in mind in terms of supporting their work, the work of the friendship centers, but also for people like you that are working in community to be aware that, those resources are there, and often, they support people in a way that Indigenous people in a way that makes most sense for them. But also more broadly, to reiterate the point that friendship centers are really part of this broader conversation this broader work that's being done to address this issue of sex trafficking across Ontario, right? So one of the clearest messages that came out of these engagements was that friendship centers are often providing these culturally grounded and these wraparound supports that may not fit kind of neatly into just one category of prevention or response, right? In reality, all sorts of different program workers and support workers at the friendship centers are doing both of these things at the same time in different ways. And you can imagine what that may look like. That's the violence prevention work, the youth and family programming, justice system navigation supports, etc. We've also heard about the value of survivor navigation, right? So staff who are sort of working in friendship centers are often helping people by walking alongside them as they try to access services, as they make decisions, and as they move through complex systems in emotionally vulnerable states, right? And that support, if done in a culturally grounded and trauma-informed way, is far more effective, right? And really has a good impact. So really, friendship centers are also creating space for resource responses to these things that are not just purely punitive, right? So if we want to think about justice or what you may call diversion programs, these are a good example of that, right? Especially when we think about what Chelsea had spoken about earlier about the criminalization of survivors and the way that systems can often inadvertently misunderstand or punish people who are experiencing this exploitation. So a lot of not to get too into the justice programming at the friendship centers, but they often take an approach that harm can be understood in terms of a rupture of relationships, right? When harm is caused, that impacts these webs of connections between people, between families, neighbors, and community, right? So approaches to justice that kind of look beyond only punishment and really ask what takes to repair harm, rebuild those relationships, and put everybody on a good path. Is sort of important in terms of responses as well. So obviously these practical supports matter, and things like childcare and stuff like that can really play a vital role in reducing these barriers and helping people access programs, appointments, and safety planning. So that's sort of the long way of saying that, it doesn't work if the response is only happening after trafficking has occurred. We need to build those conditions that reduce that vulnerability in the first place and strengthen supports for people so that they can stay safe and connected and supported in community. And just one thing I wanted to share briefly, if you could move to the next slide, Chelsea. We wanted to include this wheel, just a sort of another way of looking at this kind of holistic approach to community support. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but this is called the Healing Continuum Wheel, and it was developed back in 1993 to address family violence, or sort of help lead the work to support people that are involved in family violence. But we can also take some lessons in terms of thinking about responses to human trafficking. And the program model that Chelsea had mentioned that's in development is going to be developing from similar concepts, right? So this really takes a holistic view of a person's needs, right? That physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual are all needs that need to be addressed if someone's going to achieve that state of wellness, right? And if you can picture the three sections of this wheel, they all kind of move interdependently. But if we want to focus just on the outside for now, no, I'm not gonna, I don't carry this teaching. I'm not gonna be giving a teaching on this wheel, but just generally, if we look at the outer portion of the wheel, we can see the sort of holistic phases that we can think about in terms of any kinds of support. And this concept of healing rather than responding, as just sort of focus on wellness really demands a strategy that's different from maybe current responses, right? So there really is kind of an inherent conflict between solutions that seek balance within individuals and communities and one that is only crisis oriented, right? So this really considers, the full realm of intervention, prevention, education, and also healing and wellness. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, quite often community workers and community organizations, for reasons of funding and capacity, find themselves focusing or doing a lot of work in that crisis intervention section of the wheel, right? And I think about it, if you're spending your day putting fires out all the time and dealing with crisis and people that are in crisis, you or your center or the community more generally is not really going to have the capacity for these other equally important phases that need to be sort of part of the solution or part of the way of addressing this issue, right? So, generally speaking, within the Friendship Center context, or even more generally, this holistic approach needs to be recognized. It needs to be supported in terms of funding and program supports and things like that, right? If we're really going to sort of make progress and address this in a good way. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to pass it back to Chelsea.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll take that. Um, okay, so when we talk about prevention, it's important to recognize that is already happening across many of the spaces that you hear today on the call work in. From our engagements, what we heard is that prevention begins when systems respond to things like the housing instability, youth leaving care, gender-based violence, poverty, and mental health crises. These are often the points where individuals are already interacting with services, sometimes long before their exploitation is identified. We also heard about the importance of culture and healing and the role that connection to community plays as a protective factor. And in some cases, this includes responding to early signs of gang recruitment or other forms of risk. This is about recognizing that prevention is not separate from your work. It is already happening within these spaces, and that many of you are already doing prevention work, whether it's been identified as such or not.
Okay, thanks, Hayden. So we're coming to wrapping this up. So some of the things we've talked about and what we think is really important for all of your work and however you come to this work and how you address it is recognizing early indicators, as we talked about, intervening early when you can, if it's safe to do so, building relationships with Indigenous organizations, collaboration. I think that's really important, especially across sectors. We talked about avoiding criminalizing survivors, addressing root causes of vulnerability, but vulnerability of survivors and also vulnerability of individuals falling into becoming traffickers or, being linked to gang violence. And lastly, that flexibility creates trust. We have to be flexible if we want to see change and we want us to be successful in this work. So just to close us off, I just want to highlight a few key takeaways from what we've discussed today. Firstly, trafficking is a process. It's not a single event. It's rooted in that structural vulnerability that we see. Prevention is very important. It has to happen early. We have to move beyond crisis response. And I think that is what social service providers are inherently good at, but sometimes we fall into that space of having to respond to crisis response. And that Indigenous people deserve support to succeed, not just to survive. So let's start, if we have not, let's start thinking about what that looks like. And lastly, friendship centers are key partners. If you have not, I encourage you to walk into the closest friendship center to you. They're very open and warm and welcoming and always happy to have others come into their friendship centers, whether it's just to start a conversation, to develop a relationship, or to learn more. So thank you so much. And I guess with that, we'll welcome any questions that folks may have.
Thank you, Chelsea, Hayden, and Nick, for that informative presentation. We'll now move to audience questions. Ali Stevenson, the HSJCC's Engagement and Communications Specialist, will be facilitating audience questions. Presenters will do their best to answer as many questions as possible, so please be patient as we move through them. Just a reminder to please submit your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat. You may have to click on the More tab to find Q&A depending on your setup with Zoom.
Thanks, Trevor. And I'd say let's get right into it because we've got a few questions coming in. This first one is from the chat, just it was from a little minute ago, so I'm just gonna ask this one first. From Jody, what does human trafficking look like within First Nations communities?
Okay, I can jump in, and I'm so sorry for taking 100 hours to get us started. Um,
No worries.
but so we've heard a lot about that with our Friendship Center communities. As many of you probably know, Friendship Centers are sometimes very close to First Nation communities, and a lot of gangs sometimes are, whether they're initiated within the First Nations or outside, oftentimes end up preying within First Nations communities. And so what we've heard is Friendship Center communities are oftentimes seeing, individuals that are being trafficked outside of First Nation communities into urban areas and vice versa. We're also seeing it kind of intercultural effect happen where we're seeing not only Indigenous individuals, but even individuals that are not Indigenous being trafficked up north into First Nation communities, or sometimes falling into being the traffickers that are trafficking people within First Nations communities. So we know it's all interconnected. It's not necessarily more so happening within certain areas, but it is easier to get away sometimes with human trafficking in other areas where there's less law enforcement. And so that's definitely an issue. And also when there's not a very steady, healthy relationship and trusting relationship with law enforcement, which sometimes we see oftentimes in First Nation communities.
Awesome. Thanks, Chelsea. I'll go to the next one, and this is from Kemba. They're the manager of the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit within the City of Toronto. They're wondering, are there any stats around the experiences of Afro-Indigenous people and any culturally specific supports?
So this hasn't necessarily come up a lot. Like I said, there has been an intercultural aspect, and specifically, I'm sure many people may have seen the recent documentary of the missing Black boys, where we're seeing, Black boys, for example, being recruited into gangs, sometimes by coercion, to, traffic in other communities, and vice versa, where they're also falling, they're vulnerable to being trafficked. Um, in terms of vulnerability, at one friendship center, we did hear that where we're seeing sometimes, individuals that are partly Indigenous, partly Black are inherently more vulnerable just because both of those communities tend to be the most at risk of falling into those spaces. But I think if anything does come up, I will write down your contact and definitely follow up and be interested in learning more about your work as well.
Thanks, Chelsea. I have another question. When supporting capacity building and working with frontline workers, how have you all been able to respond to folks in the sector who still want concrete best practices, i.e., a one-size-fits-all solution, especially when working with a specific community, still experiencing a lot of resistance to the notion of tailoring and flexible responses and practices?
So I can jump in again. Sorry, I'm yapping too much.
No,
My
please
colleagues, feel
continue.
free to jump in and cut me off.
You're doing amazing.
So that's definitely something we push back on because I mean we're seeing mainstream responses to anti-human trafficking are just not working, especially for Indigenous communities. And oftentimes these mainstream capacity building supports are not even meant to support Indigenous communities. They're not incorporating Indigenous voices, especially survivors that are Indigenous in their voices. So that's something that we've been pushing more towards. It's definitely been really difficult, especially when we're seeing law enforcement and the surveillance and securitizing of the process take more place, other than, prevention and those type of things. So it's definitely been an issue. And we push back, I would say, at least I do, that it can't be a one size fits all approach, but we do have to work together. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would also just to jump in terms of programs, I would say we work, with funders, government or otherwise, we always make an effort to build in space for those um, those specific community approaches. We know that there's not one Indigenous approach. So, for example, a program like Kijin Anishinaabe, I Am a Kind Man, um, our agreements are built in a way that the coordinators can bring their elders and teachings into the program as well. And it's important to, make the case in terms of that with funders, but also if we're rooting the development of these things within community, and community is the one, building it, then I would say that those tailored approaches are just going to sort of more, hopefully naturally, sort of come about. But I think the case is, we emphasize the diversity of culture in terms of building programs and space for that to flourish in these different places.
Thank you. Thank you both. As far as a central list of friendship centers for victims or survivors, where would the best place be for folks to access like a list of friendship centers to share with victims and survivors? Website?
Yeah, I would say the website, and Ali, we can share that with you if you, I think you might have shared that earlier, but we can share that link again as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And just a question around sharing this presentation. We upload the recordings to the website, so any information that we upload to our website can be shared with your network. And that was just a question that we had around information sharing. So that's great. Can you speak to whether friendship centers seeing cases of brain injury as a result of intimate partner violence? If so, what are the responses and connections with the health systems? And perhaps this is our last question, and then any other questions can be sent to Chelsea and team via email.
Yeah, we've heard about this a lot, and it's something that's not well understood, especially with sex trafficking. Unfortunately, strangulation. That's like one of the number one things that can lead to a traumatic brain injury, apart from other physical forms of violence. So it's been a big issue, oftentimes, especially when, the survivor goes into the justice system, they're expected to provide evidence or recall what has happened in a specific way, in an orderly way. That can be really hard. So we're seeing, it's having effects across the justice system, law enforcement. And I would say, I don't know necessarily what's happening a lot policy-wise with the health field. I know that there's been a lot of risk assessments that are being developed within individual community health centers I've heard about. So I would say we definitely have to push more so towards advocacy in that area, and have to work much more closely together, because it's a very complex thing that even I'm still working to understand.
Thank you so much. I'll hand it back to Trevor.
Great. Yeah, thank you again to Chelsea, Hayden, and Nick for this fantastic presentation, and to Ali for moderating the questions. Please take a moment to provide your feedback on today's webinar. The survey link is in the chat. Thank you everyone for joining us for what I think may have broken a record for attendance.
Sure did.
So I really appreciate that for everyone attending, and keep an eye out for future webinars from us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.